I got broads in Atlanta, just to lean the family.
That was probably inappropriate given the movie that I'm about to talk about right now, but let's get into it anyway. We're going to talk about The Free State of Jones, which is that new Matthew McConaughey movie where he's trying to win another Oscar. This movie takes place in Mississippi during the Civil War era. It starts off with him as a nurse working in the battlefield. Now, this movie right away kind of gives you a real clear, gritty picture of what war is. It starts off the same way as Saving Private Ryan. Like, there are guts coming out of people's stomach. There's people with their face blown off. And it shows you how brutal war can really be, even back in those times when we didn't even have the same weapons that we have today. And Matthew McConaughey, who plays Newton Knight in this movie, he's someone who's from the South, but he doesn't really believe in the South's fight. Throughout the movie, he brings up several times that this is basically a fight for rich people to keep their cotton and their slaves, which is an interesting point or an interesting perspective to have. Because the fight in the South was primarily about slavery, but at the same time, there were a lot of white people who didn't own slaves and who didn't have much property. So they were really just poor people fighting in a rich man's fight. And he brings that up several times throughout the movie, and it leads to the whole Robin Hood thing that he does later on. But at this point, he's sort of kind of voices discontent with the war. And really what sets him off is one of his family members gets drafted. A young kid who must be between maybe 15 and 18 years old. I don't think he's really much older than that. He kind of gets drafted into the war and he finds them. But on the very first day of battle, he gets shot and killed. So that's what basically leads him to bring the body back home to be buried. But in doing so, he becomes a deserter. And unfortunately, in the South at this time, deserters were hung for basically treason in a sense. This starts the whole rebel movement where he comes back and he's seeing a lot of the injustices that are happening in his town because there's this tax in place where they have to give away 10% of what they own in terms of clothing and food to the taxpayer so that way he could feed the Confederate army. The problem is these people are abusing their power and they're taking everything these poor people already have. So that kind of makes Matthew McConaughey not exactly angry, but he starts to take action against them. And he also runs into a couple runaway slaves along the way who he has no problems with because again, he doesn't really see a difference between poor white people and slaves in the South because in one way or another they're both pawns in the rich man's scheme or in the rich man's war. So that's kind of the theme that he kind of plays on throughout the movie, and I thought it was very well done. I know that there are a lot of critics that are giving this movie a bad review. I know that on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, it's not getting a very good score. Granted, I don't really look to those websites to be the end-all be-all. I often don't really agree with their reviews or their scores. I personally enjoyed this movie. I thought it did everything that it set out to do. I thought it gave a very realistic portrayal of war and how ugly it could be. I thought it didn't overemphasize or exaggerate the honor aspect of war, and it showed that there were a lot of people who were actually really scared to fight. People who didn't want to fight, but they were obligated to, and they ended up running away because they didn't want to die or lose their life over a cause they didn't believe in. I think it shows a lot of nuances in the South because it wasn't like the whole South was for this war. It was really just kind of the rich majority fighting for this war, and some people who believed in it because they didn't want to accept equality between all races. But there were also like a group of people who just didn't agree with it at all. So, and even within Matthew McConaughey's camp, there were still people who are racist and there were people who are more accepting of race. So I like that this movie kind of showed a variety or a scale of the different opinions and the different views that were in the South at this time. I also thought the message in this movie was very interesting. You can always draw parallels between modern day times in those movies, and it's always interesting to see how far we've come, but in many ways, how we're still in the same place when it comes to certain issues. Like when it comes to inequalities, prejudice, and all that stuff, there are many parallels between then and now that we wouldn't exactly expect, but you kind of see them when watching this movie. And I'm not really going to elaborate on those. You can pick those out yourself. But I just think that it's always interesting to kind of see that in movies like this. Now, again, this movie isn't getting the best reviews, which I didn't expect because everyone loves Matthew McConaughey. And as much as I would like to see him finally kind of be in a movie that wasn't overhyped or nominated for an Oscar, I really don't understand why people don't like this movie. While there are a couple gripes to it, I think it's overall good. The few things that I don't like, though, wouldn't be a home critic review without a couple gripes, is for one, I wasn't emotionally involved or inspired by the story. Now, there are one or two powerful scenes within the movie. One of them is after a couple people were hanged, and he kind of gives a speech to the people around him. And I don't want to really kind of give it away because I thought it was very nicely placed in the movie, and I like the way that he kind of phrased it. But more or less, what he was saying is that, again, we're no different from black people at this point. We're all seen as property because the only people who are really benefiting from this war are the rich people, the people who are way above us, because they don't just take advantage of black people as slaves, they also take advantage of us by forcing us to go and fight in this war, and then they take our farm, and then they take our food, and then they take everything we own on top of that. So that is followed up by one of the coolest action scenes in this movie, which I thought was really well done. And there's another action set piece after that, and this is kind of the part of the movie where a lot of the rebel fights are taking place, and they're starting to take out a couple divisions from the army. So I thought those scenes were really powerful and really cool. The problem is, those scenes kind of come over an hour into the movie, and there's not another scene as good as that one after it. So while those scenes were great, it wasn't really enough to make me feel emotionally involved, and I wasn't inspired by the story like I was really hoping to be. Another thing about this movie is that it's 2 hours and 20 minutes, which is just way too long. Now, it's kind of hard to argue any movie besides Captain America Civil War. Oh, I just realized they were both Civil Wars. But anyway, it's kind of hard to argue a movie that's 2 hours and 20 minutes deserves all 2 hours and 20 minutes of that movie. Now, what I will say is that I don't mind a movie taking its time to kind of build up to this big point that has some sort of emotional impact or payoff. And while I do think this movie does have a couple payoffs in it, I still think it's way too long for the runtime. And the problem is, after those scenes that I mentioned with the speech and then the two big fights afterwards, those are kind of like the most entertaining parts of the movie. And then after that, you kind of get the end of the war, and then you think the movie's gonna end, but it doesn't. And then you have the whole the drama around black people voting, and you think the movie's gonna end there, but it doesn't. And then there's another thing that comes up, and you think it's gonna end there, and it doesn't. And the thing about this movie is that the reason why it's so long is because it doesn't know where to stop. After that sequence I just mentioned, which I think is the highlight of Free State of Jones, I don't think there's a really good place to end this movie. And it's not the movie's fault, it's just the way that events happened. Like after the war, while it ended in the North, the war didn't really end in the South. Like it dragged on for many years because of racism, the introduction of the KKK. You had all of these state laws that were preventing black people from having the rights that were granted to them. And basically, there's no way for you to shorten that story up because that takes place over 10, 20 something years of life in the South. And there's no way for you to just compact that in a nice, clean way. And it's also not very interesting because it's really more political, social events happening. So it doesn't really capture your attention the same way as maybe some of the war scenes earlier in the movie did. So I think the movie was trying to find a satisfactory ending. But honestly, that movie could have ran up until modern day times and it still wouldn't have found the ending that it needed. Because the peak was just so big that anything after that was just going to be disappointing. So it seems like it was just trying to find the perfect ending and never got it. And in doing so, it dragged the movie out probably a half an hour more than it needed to do. That being said, I did appreciate that this movie took the time to show all of those aspects of the war and of life in the South for the people of Jones, which is its own county in a sense, after the war. I like that they kind of showed the aftermath. I like that they showed that the war didn't really stop there for some people. And I think it's very important to kind of do that. I just don't think it works outside of a documentary style film. As far as a film whose primary purpose is to entertain as well as inform, it wasn't as entertaining as it was informing. And so I can see why a lot of people would say the ending is very boring. Another thing that I want to quickly mention, while this doesn't detract from the movie, I just question how much value it really added. This movie does a couple flash forwards to 1980s or something, perhaps 1960s. I honestly can't remember what year. But this scene takes place in court a couple generations after Newton Knight, Matthew McConaughey's character. It has to do with one of his descendants. What happens is because Matthew McConaughey marries and has a child with a African American female in this movie, they later charged that guy in 1960 with being 1/8 black. So he's technically a Negro according to Mississippi laws. I was just saying how they showed the aftermath of the events and how it didn't really, how the fight was never really over in the South. I liked how they moved it past the Civil War times into more modern times. Like I was watching it and I was finding it kind of interesting and difficult to believe that even in 19 something, the events that happened 80 or so years ago were still affecting people's lives today. And while I did enjoy having that extra element added to the story, I just wonder how effective it was because the guy who plays Newton Knight's descendant isn't very interesting. We just kind of see him standing there while the judge and the prosecutor are kind of pointing fingers at him. But he doesn't really say much and he doesn't really do much. He's pretty bland. So I felt like I didn't really care in the end about him. I just was interested in finding out that he was affected, but there was nothing about him particularly that made me really care for a situation. So I just wondered how much value that really added to the movie. Now, for my last point, I feel like the genre of Civil War films is starting to get oversaturated to some point, especially over the last couple years. We've had a lot of movies featuring slaves, slave owners, people who were in the South but didn't believe in the Confederate Army. We've had Lincoln, and these movies are similar in a lot of ways. They're all well directed, well executed, they have big actors, solid performances, 2.5 hour runtimes. My point is, with the saturation of films, and some of them even already winning an Oscar, my one thing with Free State of Jones is, what does this movie do to kind of separate itself from the others? And the answer is it doesn't really separate itself at all. I'm not trying to say that it's forgettable. I'm just saying being a good movie with solid performances isn't really enough for you to stand out in this genre anymore because all of the movies in this genre are all well executed. I feel like this movie didn't really do anything inspirational or emotional to make me feel for this movie more than any other one. And it doesn't really have anything that's going to make me go back and watch it. And I'm not going to strongly recommend this movie to other people. I think if people are interested in these kind of movies, and if they saw a trailer and they think that they're going to like it, then you should go watch it because you definitely will enjoy it. But if you're not really interested in these kind of movies to begin with, I don't really see myself recommending this movie to you. But I'm just saying in the future, I would like it if the next inevitable Civil War piece did something different that could set itself apart, because right now these movies are all starting to blur and seem like one and the same. And I just feel like that kind of takes away from it because it doesn't differentiate itself in any particular way. But those are my thoughts on The Free State of Jones. I thought it was a really cool movie. If you're looking for another Matthew McConaughey film, I think he doesn't really do a bad job in this one. Solid performance all the way through. A lot of other good characters who are playing the supporting cast. Overall, I enjoyed it. If you saw this movie, let me know what you think in the comments down below. And be sure to share this video wherever you can and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be having videos coming up all summer long for a lot of the summer movies. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.